Okay, it is November 11th, 2025. I think today is my mom's birthday. See, my mom was born in 1930. So how old would that make her? 95. Wow. She's been gone a long time. But anyway, the reason you're looking at Black Cap is I remembered something today about the time I got injured at school. And it wasn't when I was teaching, it was when I was going to school. And I went to school in London during a sabbatical from my college in Minnesota. But this is how I actually ended up in Amsterdam or went to Amsterdam for the first time was on account of getting injured at school in London. So this is kind of the story of that, but it may meander and you'll understand why. But this audio is devoted to London and my years in and out of there for family reasons. Um, I went to London before my sister married a black cab driver. And that is not a black man who drives a taxi. It is a white man driving a taxi that's black. So that's why they're called black cab drivers. So anyway, they met in Florida. He was there on vacation and he liked her and they went out, while he was on vacation and he invited her over for a wedding. And she stayed at his parents' house for like a month. And they ended up getting married, within a year or so. They got married in America. That's a whole nother story. But anyway, my sister is like 5'10". She's one of the tallest females in our family. But her husband was like, not kidding. He was shorter than me, and I'm 5'5". So he's like 5'3", 5'4". So you can imagine the wedding pictures. She did look like an Amazon woman next to him and being American and loud from a big Irish Catholic family, she married into this kind of proper British family, but they were solid middle class British. So that was the family structure that I got to know British people by, as far as living in the neighborhood with them. I would stay with my sister over a period of years. In the summertime, I didn't have to teach. And I think I was still paid in the summer because you could choose to be paid 12 months or 9 months. And so I would bring my son, who at that time was like 8, 9, 10, 11, in that age group. And my son was kind of big, not by American standards, but by British standards, he was, kind of beefier than the skinny little British boys that are, 8, 9, and 10 years old too. So, uh, but he brought his baseball bat, ball, and glove to England, and the green, which is just a plain like grass field in the middle of council neighborhoods, and he taught the neighborhood how to play baseball. And so he had no problem fitting in. They called him the American boy. I remember that. But when I got to know a British family through my sister. So when I'm talking about my mother-in-law or my father-in-law or my sister-in-law, they weren't truly my in-laws. They were my sister's in-laws, my sister's mother-in-law. So when I referred to them like that, that's who I'm talking about. But I got really close with her husband's sister, Deb. And Deb was a riot. The British are terribly funny. Their slang and just their sense of humor, a lot of deadpan, and a lot of swearing, a lot of creative swearing. So, and I have a lot of stories about learning to swear and using it inappropriately, like I said the word wanker once, in front of my mother-in-law, and Debbie, uh, my sister-in-law, turned to me and said, "Kate, you can't say that in front of my mother." And I said, "Well, but I heard it on TV." And she goes, "So?" And I said, "Well, if I heard it on TV, I figured it was okay." She goes, "Do you know what it means?" I said, "Yeah, it's an asshole. It's a jerk off." She said, "Yes." So I said, "Oh, so I can't say that in front of your mom?" "No, you can't." I said, "Oh, okay." So there are a lot of little faux pas like that. But my sister committed far more faux pas than I did, but I feel sorry for her husband. When they first got married, they had two phones. One phone was for long distance, and one phone was for local because each offered a cheaper rate. So they had those two phones. And my sister, of course, used the long distance line to call my mom. And she did that quite often. I would say the first 6, 9 months they were married. Well, I mean, she's in England and she hadn't really traveled out of the US. She had traveled within, but not outside. So, yeah, she called her mom a lot, but she paid that phone bill. He paid the local and she paid the long distance. And he bitched about it one day. I think it would have had to have been before he would leave for work. He worked nights. I mean, when you're a black cab driver, the night is where the money is. So he would leave. They lived in Kent, Bromley, Kent. So it's like a 30-minute drive out of London. And so he would leave 3, 4 in the afternoon and get into London before rush hour. So on his way out the door, he was bitching about the phone bill. And when he would get home from work, I don't know, I was always asleep, but it would be 2, 3, 4 in the morning, just depends on, when everything slowed down. So when he got home that night, he parked his cab in front of the house like he always did. And every phone in the house had been unplugged and thrown out the upstairs window and were waiting for him in the front yard. So he picked them up, I think, and brought them in. But he never bitched about the phone bill again because so once they sorted that, and she of course eventually stopped. She didn't need to call my mom quite so often. But then came wintertime and them fighting over the thermostat because she was from Florida, so she was not used to being cold. And the damp cold in England is, getting your bones cold. So she would crank up the heat and he'd come downstairs, where the thermostat was, and he would bitch. You can't have put on a sweater, put on some socks, or, he would bitch about the heating. So the way she dealt with it is she would just wait for him to leave the house. And then she'd crank up the heat and leave it up until he came back. So, that's just America bumping into British. But I found it kind of humorous. But so there came a point where I had worked for 7 or 8 years, taught 7 or 8 years in a row in Minnesota. So I was eligible for a sabbatical. So that's where you are given 2/3 of your salary, but you take a year off, 9 month, sabbatical from teaching, and most go back to school or do a research project or something like that. It has to be approved. So I signed up to do another master's degree in Goldsmith in England. And I remember I was going to compare Oscar Wilde with Joe Orton, and Joe Orton probably means nothing to you, but it was a really good idea. But um, I had an accident that stopped everything. But I'll get back to the accident in a minute because I want to share a little bit about what the neighborhood was like. This would have been a council neighborhood, and by that, there are privately owned homes, semi-detached. So they're like there's the houses are next to each other on the side, but there's like what they call a front garden and a back garden. But some of the homes are council, meaning they're provided by the council at a discounted rent, and others are either privately rented or owned. So it's a mixture. And so it to me it was just day-to-day things again, the American way of doing things bumping up against the British way of doing things, and how they dealt with problems. For example, I had a father show up at my door, and Matt had done something during a game. He didn't hit anyone. Um, I don't know what. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember what he did, but I remember the father coming over with the son and saying to me, "Are you the mother of the big American boy?" And I'm like, "Yeah." I said, "Oh my God, what did he do?" And he explained to me what happened. And I apologized immediately. And, the father was quite shocked. I think he was, planning on an argument or something. But Matt had misbehaved. Matt had misread a situation, or something had been said to him that he misinterpreted, but he had been really rude. He had said something, I think, really rude. And so, I explained to the dad that I would talk to Matt, and I apologized, to the little boy. But where I learned how to apologize and the importance of apologizing, not just in England, but in general. And it came from hanging out in a cab office, a mini cab. Now, Mary's husband was a black cab driver, and they're true licensed hackneys. They go through this 2 year long process of learning, memorizing the entire city center of London. So, and they're of course more expensive, but there are mini cabs, which are private taxis that are not legal. And you can call one into London, but they cannot pick anybody up in London. So, there's all these kind of weird rules. But um, Mary's sister-in-law her job was she was a dispatcher for a minicab company. And I was in school, so I had quite a bit of free time, and I was staying with Deb while I went to school. Mary and her husband had moved to America by this time, so I had rented a room with Deb and was staying with her and going to school. And she would sometimes be at work, and so I would go down to the cab office and just chat, because sometimes it was busy and sometimes it wasn't. But the office was split in two, and it was a kind of a small office. But the main dispatcher, I mean, the guy on the radio, was on like the other side of the wall from Deb. So people would call in, Deb would answer the phone, and people would call in and order one. They would give the address or whatever. And so she would relay it to the dispatcher. So I would be sitting in a chair with a cup of coffee and chatting with Debbie in between phone calls and things like that. So, but in the meantime, I'm listening to how they're dealing with customers on the phone, the British way of dealing with people who are upset. And this is a really valuable lesson. So many, I can't even count how many times somebody would call and order a cab, and it didn't come, or it went to the wrong address or whatever, and people would call back and just lay into Deb, just start yelling, and the first thing she would do is apologize immediately. I do, and those are the exact words that came out of her mouth. I do apologize, sir. Blah 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 blah. Hang on, let me check with the dispatcher, because she was not in direct contact with the driver, but the dispatcher was. So she would oi at him, like tap on the window, and what's up with this or that, and he would respond to her. And in the meantime, he's also talking to the drivers. um so I would overhear these conversations. And so when it's with a customer, they were ultra polite and professional and apologetic, when they, fucked up. So, but I would listen to the dispatcher, and he too would have friends come into the office on his side of the partition, and there was a chair, and he would sit in the chair, and those two, oh, it was 9 times out of 10 a driver, that was like getting off shift or going on, whatever, come in and have a chat. And he would come in and say hello, and the dispatcher would say piss off, and the driver would say, well, that's rude. And the dispatcher would say, oh, excuse me, please piss off. And, and then they would yuck, 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 yuck. But, it was that kind of environment and sarcasm and British expressions, which is where, I learned a lot of them. So I really enjoyed that part. Debbie had a 7-year-old daughter at that time. She's all grown up now. This is how long ago. But Debbie had remarried and was pregnant. And she was explaining to her daughter, she was going to get a brother or a sister. And so I remember the week before my accident, Georgina had a bedtime routine and would take a bath, and she would read, or her dad would read to her, or whatever. There was a bedtime ritual. And sometimes I would be upstairs, like reading in my room, and her room was like across from mine. So I would hear this ritual. And she uh, was given a book about reproduction that came with a little video for Deb to try and explain to her where babies come from, because of course that as soon as she told her she was going to have a brother or a sister, she was asking a lot of questions. So that's Debbie got a book and a video. And so Georgina would sit in bed after her bath, and her mom or dad would come up, and she would have a book, and she would say, I'm having a bit of a read. And she had the reproductive book in bed with her. And she'd flip through the pages, and her dad would run out of the room and go get Deb. Her dad, her stepdad, was from Ireland, and talking about sex, forget it. Ford, and he was such an innocent when it came to female reproduction. He didn't know anything. Uh, so it was Deb's job. He said, no, no, no. So Debbie, was in this dilemma, of how to deal with this. And she and I would have coffee every morning. She smoked, but she hid it from her parents. And with me living with her and me smoking, it gave an excuse for the house to smell like smoke in case her mother ever showed up. So we'd sit in the kitchen, another favorite thing we used to do, and drink coffee and have toast in the morning and smoke and talk. And she's telling me, she said, I don't know. how to answer her questions. I said, well, just, answer them. And she goes, I can't get it out of my mouth. She goes, I have to admit, I'm just flat out embarrassed. So I said, well, you got her video, right? She goes, yeah. And she's watched it several times, but it doesn't, she goes, there's at the point of penetration, she said, that part is missing. And she's not going to understand that word. I just, so this dilemma is going on for like a week of how to explain to Georgina where babies come from. So everybody was gone one afternoon, and or like I said, this was about the time of my accident, and it might have been the day after my accident because I was home alone with Georgina during the day, and I was normally at school. So this was probably, like I said, it was the week I had the accident. But so George, I put the video in. She had the book again, and I said, your mom said there was a video with this, and she goes, yeah. And I said, go put it in. So she did, and this is back with the VCR. I don't know. It might have been a disc, a CD, but anyway, she pops it in. And she's got the book, and we go to the beginning, and we're following along with the book as it's going through the step by step. And like Deb said, when they got to the point of actual, the moment of conception, the video, just all these flowers, just and butterflies, just come on the screen. So I could see the problem. And Georgina had the remote. And I swear to God, at that point, she kept backing it up to just beyond where the flowers came. And then fast forward it, get to the flowers, back it up again and again. She knew she was missing something, that something was happening before. Oh, sorry. The flowers and the butterflies. And she had the book. And in the book, on one page was male anatomy, like in a biology book. And if you flip the page, there was female anatomy, like from a biology book. So I looked at Georgina, and we were on the page with male biology. And I pointed to that picture, of a penis. And I said, Georgina, this, and I flipped the page to the female side, and I said, that goes in here. And she looked at me and she said, well, that's what I thought. And I said, yeah, yeah. I said, everybody's a little embarrassed about it, but I said, this is where babies come from. And when you love somebody, it comes natural, Georgina. Don't worry. This is Mother Nature knows what she's doing. And the result is you're gonna have, a baby brother or a baby sister, and that's what's really cool. So that was very typical of, daily life, staying with a family, outside London. So now getting to the accident, this is going to take a few minutes because it's weird. I talked during the Amsterdam audio about how going to the Chinese temple, looking back now, kind of was a preview of where I was going next. And just like my being in London, for, like I said, several summers before, and then followed by the beginning of a school year. The accident happened within the first couple months of school. So I schooled at Goldsmith. They were working on painting and, stuff that they do the beginning of any school year in any building at any university. So we had a break between classes. And so I went out and had a cigarette, and I had a cup of coffee too. So, we students would have a chat. Sometimes the professors would come out if they smoked or whatever, so we would go back in, and So I was going up the stairs and I had cigarettes in one hand and cup of coffee in the other. So I'm walking up the stairs and my foot tripped on the last step. And to the right of me was the hand railing. And I went to grab the hand railing when I, felt the initial fall, but they had just painted it. And so there was a wet paint sign on a black railing, and I had on a white sweater. So, this was those momentary decisions. And I didn't grab it because I don't know, I just didn't, instinct went no. So I cannonballed into the corner of a cement wall, like with my head, just it was a thunk sound. And I fell like boom on my knees. And the first thing that went through my mind is my father had died that year. My dad had actually died like less than 6 months before I had gone over. So I was still in grief for my dad, but he had died from a broken neck. And so the first thing that went through my mind is, Jesus fucking Christ, Kate, you could have broke your neck. I somehow knew it wasn't broken, but I knew it was a really stupid accident. So, of course, one of my professors and several, classmates were standing right there. So they held me up and I didn't feel any pain. And I hadn't broken, like I said, I hadn't broken my neck or anything like that. And I kind of felt fine. And I thought it was weird that I didn't feel any pain. But I do, they were asking me, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I think I am. I said, man, that was weird. And but I remember feeling something warm, really warm on the top of my head and a flowing feeling. And so I stuck my hand on the top of my head and pulled my hand out, and it was covered in blood. And what had happened was when I hit the wall, I had literally split my scalp on the top of my head and I had to get like 15 stitches. And if you've ever had a scalp wound or seen a scalp wound, they bleed like hell. They're not fatal. I mean, unless you put no pressure on them or whatever. But I remember when I saw that, they immediately sat me down, and again, I had a white sweater on. So I'm looking at the blood on my hand and I'm thinking, oh man, I don't want to get this on my sweater. So they sat me down and I'm leaning forward as far as I can to, keep the blood off my sweater. But I remember putting my hand back on top of the wound and feeling safer, or I don't know, it was a really weird instinctual thing to cover the wound with my hand, because my hand, from the time it happened, it never moved. The blood poured through my fingers because, like I said, I leaned over so that it wouldn't get on my sweater. But it started to make a rather large pool on my feet. And this is happening in the stairwell. And it had happened during change of classes. So, of course, nobody could get up or down the stairs. And the secretary was called, and she leaned over the railing and took one look. And of course, she called an ambulance, and they came and they got me. And, they walked me out of there and took me to the hospital. And, God bless socialized medicine for national health, because I was a student enrolled in England, I was automatically covered by national health. So when I got there, I'm like asking them, do you need my insurance card or what paperwork do I need? And, as soon as they heard the accident happened at school, they were like, nah, don't worry about it. You're here. And they took care of me. And now this is where the story gets a little weird. Is that morning that it happened. Remember, I had told you about sitting in the kitchen with Deborah most mornings before school having coffee or whatever. But the morning I had the accident, I got up, and I got up before they did. And so I would make coffee. And I opened the kitchen door and I looked, and the entire kitchen was covered in black feathers. And I'm like, what the fuck? Now, there was a cat flap, and the dog, Rosie, a little Yorkie, dumbest Yorkie on the planet, her bed was in there, and the cat could come and go at night. And so then I looked down and I saw a blackbird, not a raven, but I thought it was a raven. It was a blackbird though, and it was right at the door. So I had stepped over it to get into the kitchen. And I fucking didn't know what to do. I mean, the entire kitchen is covered in black feathers. Clearly, the cat, like toyed with that thing for a long time to get feathers everywhere. So I went back upstairs, this is like 6 in the morning, and went into Vince and Debbie's room, which I never ever did, especially not in the morning. But, I said, "Oh, I'm so terribly sorry." I said, "But there's a dead bird in the kitchen and there's feathers everywhere, and Tiggy's eating the bird. I don't know what to do." And so Debbie puts a foot in her husband's back and said, "Vince, go take care of it." And he says, "Why? I don't have to feed the cat now." It's like, "Fuck you." And she like gave him a boot out of bed. And she's like, "Sort it," which means take care of it. So I had turned the kettle on. So I had made a cup of coffee, but I went in the living room instead of the kitchen. So it was really weird to be in the living room in the morning. But Deb came downstairs, and her husband Vince had, picked up the dead bird and taken it outside, and Deb had like swept up the feathers or whatever. And she came in the living room and she said, "Kate, they're cats, and he's a neighborhood cat, and it's true, indoor, outdoor, and he like ruled the neighborhood in the evening. He was a tomcat." And she was like, "Cats are just like that." And I said, "Deb, I know that. I mean, that's not a big deal. That's not what's bugging me." And she said, "Well, what is?" And I said, "Well, it's just really bad luck." She said, "What do you mean it's bad luck?" I said, "I stepped over a dead blackbird." I said, "Okay, maybe this is an Irish thing, but they have a thing about white birds and blackbirds. Like when something is really rare, they have an expression, something as rare as a white blackbird. So, with the Irish, when they come, they're either good, really good luck or really bad luck. So stepping over a dead blackbird or having an encounter with a dead blackbird is bad luck." And Deb said to me, "Oh, Kate, you're being silly." And now I read tarot cards in England, as I mentioned before, so I didn't feel silly at all telling Deborah that, I just had a creepy fucking feeling about it, and she laughed at me. And so I'm finishing up in ER, and I need to get a cab home. And so I called Deb. She's at home, and I called her up, and she says, "Well, how are you?" And I said, "Well, that's why I'm calling." And she goes, "I just got off the phone with my mom, and I told her all about the bird and bad luck, and we're just laughing our arses off about it." I said, "Well, I'm calling to tell you I'm at the ER. I fell up the stairs at school and I've got 15 stitches in my head, and I'm on my way home, but I need a mini cab." So you bitch, call call Doug and tell me where I'm at this hospital. Tell me what entrance, where do I wait for him, whatever, whatever. So she hangs up the phone and she orders me a cab, and he comes to get me. And of course, immediately she calls her mother back and she says, "Mom, you're never going to believe where Kate is." And so she relays the story to her mom about the accident. So this is when, like, the next morning after that is when Georgina and I had the facts of life discussion. And I remember that week particularly because my habit is to read every evening. Sometimes if I take a nap in the afternoon, whatever. But I mean, every night is how I go to sleep. But after the accident, they did not tell me don't read. They really didn't give me any instructions that I recall. But the first morning I woke up, so this would be the day with Georgina, I had two black eyes. And I thought that was weird because you couldn't see anything on my face. The wound was on the top of my head. And I immediately saw these two black eyes forming, and I thought, wow, that's weird. I didn't know that was going to happen. So I went to a local beauty parlor and I had her wash my hair because no way was I going to deal with the stitches. So Deb went with me and we did that. But it turns out I started, my vision in one eye got wonky. And I thought, well, what's up with that? Because I wear glasses, but I noticed a difference. So I mean, I was so stupid. You didn't Google things back then, but I covered the eye that was wonky. And so I'm reading with one eye, which don't take my advice. Never ever do this. So I'm reading with one eye, and it doesn't take very long for me, to this. I didn't go blind or anything, but everything was blurry. So the next morning, I tell Deb and she goes, you need to ring the doctor. Just ring, she said, ring the GP. She says, that's how you do it. So I rang the GP, and I went in and she had a look at me to make sure. They did an x-ray, but she was double checking I didn't have a concussion or whatever. But she told me, don't read. She says, they should have told you not to. She said, your vision, this is a temporary, this is just trauma. The entire electrical system in your head and face and scalp are in a reconnecting mode. The nerves, she said, the reason you felt no pain was the nerves were all severed. You did this clean impact, like I said, it was like a cannonballed into the wall, and so it was a single, like a one hit thing. But so because I could not read, I thought, I would be going back to school in a couple of days. But it turned out it sabotaged the entire semester. What I was originally thinking. Okay, well, if I can't read, I was falling behind. After 1 week, you would not, just can't imagine the amount of reading in graduate school you are given, especially in the beginning of a term. And I couldn't do any of it. So even if I was healthy enough and, well enough and, not getting dizzy enough to go to school, I couldn't do any of the reading. So I remember chatting with Deb and I said, fuck, I said, what do I do? And she goes, well, just chill. She goes, it's not your fault. And I said, no, it's that goddamn bird's fault. And she laughed, and, we were like, man, that is so weird. But I told her, I said, I have always wanted to go to Amsterdam. I've always wanted to go to the Van Gogh Museum. And Deb knew I painted, and, she was real supportive of that. So there were all these cheapo, take a break deals from London to Amsterdam. So I did like a 3-day trip or whatever. And I never did tell that story about my first trip there, but I'll have to save that for another day because that's an Amsterdam story. But because of that visit, and realizing that there was no way I was going to be able to finish the semester, I changed my plans. I turned and decided to spend the rest of the sabbatical. So there was about 5 months left on the sabbatical, so I went to Amsterdam, and I lived in temporary, accommodations that go round, but that's when I fell in love with Amsterdam. So that is the story of London and how a blackbird sent me to Amsterdam and kind of changed my future. So that is the end of this one, and till next time.